Hello and welcome to Lecture 6 of Phil 10, Critical Thinking at Penn State Berks. This lecture is identifying arguments. We'll look at their flows, the premises, and also the conclusions. In the past, perhaps the examples that were used to illustrate the various types of syllogisms and how to determine whether or not arguments are valid or not, we've used very simple, let's say we use very simple propositions that made the points clear and also easy to understand, but then it doesn't translate into everyday language because nobody talks in perfect a proposition syllogisms. So this is more of an art than it is anything else. In other words, you will learn certain principles that can be applied in order to try to ferret out whether or not what somebody is saying is even an argument. But it takes a lot of practice to try to start determining exactly where within the argument, once it's been determined to be such, you'll find the conclusion and then the premises, and then how do the premises relate exactly to the conclusion? Are they interdependent? Are they dependent on each other? Is this a complex syllogism and such? So that only comes with time, just like everything else. You can learn the principles of grammar for any particular language, but it takes quite a bit longer to become fluent in that. So when we talk about identifying arguments, let's first just start with the notion of what is it that we do when we are having a discussion with somebody. In other words, nobody simply presents an argument in a formal way like you would see perhaps at a debate or a dialectic, and then the person responds. There's always, this interchange that goes on between, what we'd say the speaker and the interlocutor. So when people are trying to have conversations, we constantly are looking to make sure that we understand them properly so that we could structure their argument and then respond back to the argument, either affirming it or pointing out some problem with the logical validity of it or the soundness of one of the propositions. So we always try to determine the details. Now remember, you can call these facts, but that's a little misleading because we saw that facts and opinions are not that different. So we rather use the term state of affairs. So it has nothing to do with our psychological, let's say, approach to the particular situation. If the door is open, whether or not the door is actually open is the state of affairs. So we keep, asking questions to try to determine exactly what it is that is the foundation of what we're speaking about. And then we're always trying to clarify terms, and we should never feel hesitant to do that with others, nor should we feel defensive when somebody tries to do that with us, as long as the whole goal is to reach a truth and not to simply berate the other person. And it's also, too, this isn't like when we say, is it worth the argument? But not all things are worth arguing about, right? So you wouldn't argue about what is the best flavor ice cream. You might argue about who has better ice cream because you might say, well, this particular ice cream shop, one I'm thinking of, they have the dairy cows right outside, and they really have turned it into what I guess we can call a craft ice cream. And you would think that that's a little bit higher of a threshold of what would constitute a good ice cream as opposed to somebody sitting in their house just simply churning out something on a machine they bought through Amazon. But nonetheless, is it worth the argument? It's not because our time perhaps could be better spent, although that might be true. It's just that, in colloquial terms, what we often say, I'm not going to die on this hill, or pick our battles. Those phrases come from the common sense way to determine whether or not this argument's worth jumping in on. And then clarity. So analogies sometimes are difficult because they are simply analogies. They're never the same thing as what you're talking about. You're always making comparisons. But nonetheless, examples and analogies often help to illustrate, at least to yourself or to the other individual, it's some medium. In other words, if somebody is saying something and you can't quite relate to it, you could ask, is it like this? And as long as you let them come back and say, well, yes, provided you understand X and Y in this way, that's true. And this is always the best, so that you understand them correctly, without being condescending. Summarize the argument back, restate it with whatever skills that you have acquired and learned and honed. Now you can come back and say, the way that I understand what you're asking me is this. The way I hear the point you're trying to make is this. And if they say yes, precisely, now you're on good grounds. At this point now you can do something, either affirming it, either denying it, looking to whether or not the structure of it is valid, and perhaps if any of the propositions themselves are lacking soundness. Now once you've done all this, there's still something else that has to be, let's say, worked out. Not everything that somebody says is an argument, of course. Sometimes, as you'll see, they could just be making a point and just exclaiming something. Also, it gets, this is a little bit of a reiteration, it gets a little difficult to determine exactly what is being said. So if you can determine once that, let's say first, that they are indeed making an argument, then the next step, using some of the ferreting out skills that I previously mentioned, what exactly is being said. And then once you get to that point, and you have summarized, at least mentally, the argument, now you can determine whether or not it's logically valid. And once you've done that, if it is logically valid and the premises are true, then you're going to say that the argument is true. At this point, you have no choice except to logically accept the conclusion, which, if it's based on true, let's say, state of affairs premises, and also the structure itself is logical, valid, then you have to accept the conclusion. Now, we've been talking here about deductive arguments. So we're talking about those arguments to work from premises to a conclusion. So a deductive argument would be all apples are fruits, and all fruits ripen. Therefore, all apples ripen. Now, each of those premises, 1 and 2, we would say, are, a true state of affairs. They, contain the truth value of what they are trying to express. And they also, as an overall argument, this is placed in logical form. So therefore, we have to accept all apples ripen. We're going to say that that itself is both a logically valid argument and it's also a sound argument. Now, things that may or may not be arguments. A contingent conditional. So, this is the argument where we're simply saying, if P then Q. So now the antecedent doesn't necessarily imply the consequence. So if you have a key, then you can open the door. That's not an argument. You can't, remember, that's not symmetrical. You can't simply say, well, because you open the door, you have the key. So it's just what would be called a contingent conditional. Somebody's simply inferring one thing from another. So not necessarily an argument. Also, an explanation is not an argument, and neither is simply a declarative statement. So if somebody were to say Nihara is not in class because she is sick, you wouldn't go back and try to rebut that, unless she was there, right? Unless the state of affairs was wrong. But nonetheless, they're just simply stating something. Like, this is what I believe. This is my psychological assent to what I know. Also, declarative statements are not arguments. They're just these exclamatory phrases like, hey, that's on fire, or I feel bad, or we're going to have a baby, so I feel great. Now, again, these seem obvious, but the way that you work through this, and to be careful, because even in a contingent conditional where you see the word then, you're thinking that somebody's setting some sort of argument up. These words like then and because and so, they give that sense that there's something being affirmed here that's part of an argument, a deductive argument, where you have at least two premises, remember, that have to have some relation to prove the truth of the conclusion. So just because these words show up does not necessarily identify it as an argument. So the way that you understand this is if somebody is not trying to prove something. When somebody says Nihara is not in class because she's sick, there's nothing to be proved there. They're simply explaining it. You wouldn't go back and say, unless you had some other state of affairs that you knew, you wouldn't go back and say no, right? If somebody were to say all apples ripen, they're trying to prove that to you. They're trying to say, look, this is why all apples ripen. So in contemporary conversations, you have seen this even being used as a rhetorical trick. So this is something that's a little bit outside of the box here, not part of what your text covered. When somebody starts expressing their feelings, this is how I feel, you are not in a mode where you can make a sensible argument. So if somebody were to accuse another of, say, misogyny, now, you can talk about the actual state of affairs as to whether or not you or the other person may think that constitutes misogyny. But if a person says, I feel that that has really, say, diminished me as a human person, okay, that's not an argument. They are simply declaring to you what it is, how they feel. So your response to somebody who says, like, let's make it simple. If somebody were to say, I feel sad, they're not making an argument, and your answer is not, no, you don't. You can inquire as to why they may feel sad, and perhaps the conditions they offer you may not seem sufficient, and there might be a weak presentation of why they feel sad, but nonetheless, they're not trying to prove anything to you. So one thing you can at least do when you're trying to identify an argument, besides going through all these various details, terms, and summaries and such, and simply ask yourself, are they trying to convince me of something? Or are they just telling me? Or are they just saying it? If they're not trying to convince you of something, then you're not in front of an argument. All right. Now, it gets a little difficult sometimes to be so precise as to determine what exactly are the indicators that will help you find a conclusion in an argument. Now, I want you to keep in the back of your mind as you're listening to this that when you're listening to somebody, your goal is to understand what they are saying as firmly as possible. That's why we always make sure we end in a summary, and that we make sure they at least come back and concur, yes, that's exactly what I meant and such, because we don't want to be arguing against something that they're not trying to express, or let's say finding some sort of problem with the validity or truth values and such. So we look for certain words that pop up. When somebody is trying to make an argument, they will usually, at some point, start using the words, because, well, so, well, therefore, well, this is why I think, or as a result, and consequently, and such. They're good things to look for. They're not always there necessarily. As you can see up in the conditionals, even explanation, it shows up. But that doesn't mean they're an argument. But at least it's something to, how you want to say, get the antennas up, right? Now, remember, an argument is always going to have at least two premises that are going to lead to a conclusion. So you're trying to find out exactly where these premises might exist within the argument. So you look for things that says my point is, or because of, or since I, or in the view of, something like that. Now, the reason why this is so important is because we're going to look a little bit about seeing, let's say, word paragraphs, let's put it that way, and within the paragraphs, how to ferret out exactly where the argument is, and where exactly you can find, or at least techniques to help you find the premises and the conclusion. Because remember, if you can find one of those premises, and that becomes the foundation upon which the next thing is determined, particularly the conclusion, then that's how you basically can undermine their reasoning, or I shouldn't say undermine their reasoning, but you can ferret out any difficulties that they have, let's say, managed along the way in order to show either validity overall in the logical structure, or perhaps just simply, let's say, one of the truth values within the particular proposition. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to look at what is not an argument, and then we're going to look at how these things could almost be put into an argument. And you can see a little shout out here. I'm using an example we had from the last class. So if somebody were to say, when I bought new tires for my car, the salesperson told me they guaranteed them for 60,000 miles on a normal wear. They didn't last very long. Now, if somebody is saying that to you, they're not trying to prove anything. At this point, all they're doing is declaring. They're just simply saying this is what happened, okay? If somebody then goes farther and says, I ran over a nail and damaged my sidewall, so it only lasted 3 weeks. Again, they're not trying to prove anything to you, so there's nothing for you to do except perhaps to share in their misfortune. That is nothing more than an explanation. It's just a statement of their particular beliefs. Now, here I'm putting it into an argument. Now, I have some color-coded, text here, and I'll line that up with the minor and major premise and the conclusion shortly. So, if we took this basic idea but put into a different form, if the individual were to say, when I bought new tires for my car, the salesperson told me they guarantee them for 60,000 miles under normal wear. They didn't last nearly that long, and he should have explained what normal wear meant. I was only driving on the highway, hit a nail, and ruined my tire. He worded the warranty in a way that made me believe if I didn't drive off-road, the warranty would cover the tires for 60,000 miles. I'm going to go in and argue with him over this. All right. Now, we're going to start out by saying the conclusion. What that individual is really trying to show is that this person worded a warranty in a way that was deceptive. All right? So, therefore, the way I understand the warranty is how he should have, how he should cover my tires, the cost of my tires. Now, it's important because if this were something that happened to us, if this were a real life situation, and we wanted to go in and actually say something to the salesperson, this would be the strongest way to do it. So I put these, premises and conclusion all in A propositions. Again, that's the easiest, right? So we're going to say the minor premise, the way I was told how he should cover my tires. The way I was told is how he should cover my tires. So if we wanted to put this in pure logical form, all that which is the way which I was told, is all of that which is the way he should cover my tires. All right, so that's, nobody talks like that, but that's how we would say it. And the minor premise will be the way I understand the warranty is the way that I was told it. Therefore, the way I understand the warranty is how he should cover my tires. Now, you notice that the way that I worded this, I was careful to take this middle term. So remember, the middle term is the the term. It's just that, which is never just a word typically. And in the A proposition, if you could recall, the all S is P, so that when the subject is always distributed and the predicate is undistributed. So I made sure that I was going to do this all S is P and all S is P. I made sure that that middle term was at least once in the subject position so that it would be distributed once. If it wasn't, then I would have had an undistributed middle, and that would have been a fallacy. So let me read this as it is, and then I'll read it in an undistributed middle. And you're going to say it says the same thing, but the logic doesn't work. The way I was told it is how he should cover my tires. And the way I understand the warranty is the way that I was told it. Therefore, the way I understand the warranty is how he should cover my tires. If I were to say, the way he should cover my tires is the way I was told it, and the way I understand it is the warranty is the way that I was told it. Therefore, the way I understand the warranty is how he should cover my tires. At that point, I would have taken the middle term, the way I was told it, and in both the minor and major premise, it would have been in the, let's say, in the predicate position. It would never have been distributed. So therefore, I would have had an undistributed middle. So even though somebody might say, but isn't the argument sort of the same? No, the conclusion is the same, and although you may agree with the truth of the conclusion, the truth value of the conclusion, you did not arrive at it in a logical manner. So if this happened to somebody, and you wanted to go back and make the case, putting it into the format that I have there is the best way to do it. Okay. Now, let's look briefly about diagramming arguments. Now, there's many different ways to do this. I've sort of taken the way that the text is laid it out and won't quite show it here in the same exact manner, and I'll explain why in a sec. I don't want to make that sound confusing. So the way that you would do any sort of text is, you could do this just for practice. Obviously, once you get good at this, then this becomes almost like a reflexive for us. So you have to try to separate the propositions, and typically it's good to put those into brackets. And then whatever the indicators are, the because, the ors, the so's, and such, or therefores, do those things in some sort of box, all right? not everybody uses indicators, throughout. So you could put those in parentheses, like even though somebody may not say since, or let's be fancy, henceforth, right? You can at least add those in with parentheses. And when you're done, you diagram the relation. Now, I'm only going to do part of these just because it would be way too cumbersome here on the slides to try to work it all out. But let's talk about 3 different types of arguments that we'll call them, that we can put into some sort of diagram and flow. The first will be dependent premises. Now, this means that each of the premises, are necessary, together. So they're actually dependent on each other in order to support the conclusion. So here's the argument. I would live forever if I could transfer my consciousness to a computer, provided my consciousness is all of me. All right? So somebody is trying to prove something there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to start bracketing it off, right? And I'm being a little liberal here because I don't want to get so technical and try to show exactly where we might have to add a word to make it sound right and such. But nonetheless, I think I could at least break it up into 3 different propositions at this point. And what I'm going to at least do is I'm going to number them. So I would live forever as my first proposition. I'll put I can transfer my consciousness as the second, and provided my consciousness is all of me. So if I were to try to diagram this, then what I'm going to find is that they're trying to make the argument I would live forever. That's the conclusion. Now, the way they're getting to that is they're trying to say, provided, first of all, that my consciousness is all of me, right? That is absolutely necessary for me to live forever. And also that I can transfer my consciousness. So those 2 are both dependent in order to reach the conclusion I would live forever. So if I were to put this into, say, a different form, I might say, if my consciousness is all of me, and I can transfer my consciousness to a computer, then I would live forever. So all we're trying to do is simply, diagram these 3 premises, and there are 2 premises which are dependent on each other, reaching the conclusion. But you notice here how the conclusion came in the front part of this argument, right? So again, this is arguments in everyday language. So you get a little bit better at trying to figure out exactly what it is you're trying to prove. And oftentimes we'll use words like, what exactly do you mean? What's your point? That type of thing, right? So we're using those techniques to clarify. Now, in independent premises, each premise is necessary for the conclusion, but they aren't necessary for each other. So each of those would support the conclusion regardless of the other. So here we go. Here's a good song from Meatloaf. And I would do anything for love, I'd run right into hell and back. I would do anything for love, I'd never lie to you, and that's a fact. But I'll never forget the way you feel right now. All right. So I don't need to bracket these because this being a lyrical song, each of those phrases will say are they're already the premises. But we'll number them. And I won't number the one that's been reiterated. So at this point now, what I'm going to say is that what he is trying to say is he would do anything for love. So once again, we have our conclusion up front, which you're going to find is oftentimes what people do. They're stating up front what they want to, the point they want to make, and then they're going to start adding things below it. What these diagrams are telling us is whether or not the premises are dependent on each other or whether they're all independent. So here we'd say, I'd run right into hell and back. Okay, that's the support. He would do anything for love. And also, he'd never lie to you, and that's a fact. And also, I'll never forget the way you feel right now. And all those things are just supporting premises for the conclusion, which is I would do anything for love, but they're independent of each other. All right. I think that probably seems a little bit more understandable. Now, the last one, I think they use a different term in the text. I'm going to use the more ancient term called sorites. They're also known as chain syllogisms. So I'm not sure if they use the term contingent or not. Now, we're going to get into more of this in the next week and such, but at least it's good here to start talking about it per se, because there's many other ways in which arguments appear in everyday language than these 3, right? But at least with a sorite, propositions that are in the conclusion of one become the premise of another. So think of these like as in a chain. Now, as a little side note, if you want to go in to some sort of search engine and type in the Sorites paradox, you're going to see almost another form of an argument that we talked about last week in terms of the argumentum ad absurdum, how if one person doesn't vote, then their vote doesn't matter, but yet there's 200,000 people in Reading. Well, when you talk about the Sorites paradox, it's if you have 1 grain of sand and then 2 grains of sand, at what point do you have a heap of sand? As opposed, where do you make the call? Sorites is the Greek word for heap. Okay, so that's kind of where the whole thing comes together. Nonetheless, here's just a little fictional few sentence argument. My brother and I do not get along. It all started when my mom let me stay out later when we were kids. He's been waiting for the opportunity to get back at me. Well, he did. My girlfriend now goes out with someone else. Once after me and my girlfriend made a movie date, he wouldn't drive me. All right. Now, if I start trying to at least bracket out, and at this point, you don't even have to try to determine what exactly is the conclusion or what are the premises. Just try to lay things out and say, I think this would be a good way in order to divide out the various premises. And here we wind up with 5 of them. So I'll go back and just number them, and simply the way that they appear is good enough. And one more time, we're going to try to see exactly where does the conclusion, what is the point he's trying to make? What's his final thing? Now, we're going to have to try to determine what are some indicators. Now, you notice I'm not putting things in brackets here, and I'm not adding the indicators, within parentheses. It just would be too cumbersome, and this would wind up looking like some sort of John Madden, sports diagram on, you would see on watching a football game and such. But where you hear or see him say, well, he did, you're almost getting that this is his finality, right? So I'm going to call that the conclusion. What he's trying to come up with is, this is why my girlfriend goes out with somebody else, okay? But he says why his girlfriend goes out with somebody else has a lot to do with the fact that his brother was waiting to get back at him. But why was his brother waiting to get back at him? Well, first of all, we know him and his brother don't get along, all right? And we also know that it all started when his mom let him stay out later. So those two things became premises that led to the conclusion that his brother's waiting to get back at him. But now that conclusion becomes a dependent premise with the fact that he could not get a ride for his date. So when you tie those two things together, that then will now show and prove why his girlfriend now goes out with someone else. So I hope that this doesn't seem too complex, and that because I left out, circle indicators and such, you don't think I'm, skirting the issue. But this is all shorthand. So could you imagine doing this to a particular news article, right? So, maybe you have a screen program where you can mark things up online. But if you had a paper in front of you, it wouldn't be too hard in pencil or pen to start making brackets around things and numbering them and try to figure out what goes where. Now, again, the reason why you'd be doing this is to try to determine, is this a good argument? What exactly is the conclusion? If you can't put this into some sort of, flow, if you can't figure out what the conclusion is, and you can't determine what the premises are specifically that support it, then you're never going to really be able to say you fully agree. Nor can you come out and say that there's a problem with your logic. It's not enough, perhaps, to simply say one of those premises may not be true, because if they're not a premise that directly supports something, then perhaps they're not part of the argument. I could have made this paragraph much more colorful and added a lot of things. What his mother was baking, why he was allowed to stay out later, the circumstances. So there could be a lot of things that I put in there that, let's say, almost deflect from the points that we're trying to make. A lot of rhetorical moves that could be put into place. So it gets important just to figure out how does this exactly work. Nonetheless, I hope this is a good start for you to work out the logic of arguments as they might appear in everyday language. Thank you for listening.